Bros here for a Scallydandle, this time to Mauritania through a book called The Desert and the Drum by a Mauritanian writer called Mbarak Ould Beyrouk. And this book was written in 2015 and was translated into English in 2018 by Rachel McGill. And it's the first book to be translated into English by a Mauritanian author, which is why, of course, I read it, because, you know, I like to read things from countries where I've never read something by an author from that country before. I must find a neater way of saying that. And sometimes when I read these books in translation and perhaps like slightly more obscure novels from particular places, sometimes it's fascinating, but the book itself is not necessarily that satisfactory as a work of literature, if that makes sense. But this is one of the occasions when this is a good book, a book that I enjoyed in and of itself as a piece of fiction, as well as finding it intriguing as, oh, wow, look, here's a book from Mauritania. So I'll explain a bit about why. But first, let's locate Mauritania in our heads, because I know it's not necessarily a country that people are incredibly familiar with. So it's in northwest Africa. So picture the continent of Africa, unless, you know, you're from there, in which case you'll know it well, won't you? But and you know, there's kind of like a bulge out to one side, yeah, on the west, northwest of Africa, and Mauritania is like kind of the middle bit of that bulge. So if you imagine kind of to the north of it, you've got Western Sahara, interesting country, that one of those countries where it's like, is it a country, is it recognised as a country or not? Complicated history, including war with Mauritania. Then you go working round, you've got Algeria, Mali, Senegal, and in the middle of those is Mauritania, and it comes down and has like a coastal strip, so a strip of Atlantic coastline, and about 90% of Mauritania is basically Sahara Desert. So thinly populated, interesting history, obviously, because of the kind of trans-Saharan trade routes. It has a city, Chinguetti, which is like a less well-known Timbuktu, has like kind of ancient Islamic libraries, and yeah, sort of from 7th century into sort of medieval times. Really interesting. But as a country, well, it didn't kind of have a kind of Mauritania as it is now, with the borders it is now, was never a place before French colonisation. Was part of French West Africa, and then in 1960 got its independence and became a nation, without having kind of perhaps, yeah, been one before, if that makes sense. Most of the population, I guess, were nomadic pastoralists, you know, like Bedouin people keeping, you know, sheep and cattle and camels and moving around in the desert, because, you know, it's hard to sustain a settled life in desert for obvious reasons. Coastal strip is where more of the population live, and is a bit moister, shall we say. So yeah, that's your kind of flavour of Mauritania, I guess. Not a country that I'm at all familiar with, I have to say. And so that was why it was a particular pleasure to read a book from there. Its post-colonial kind of history has not been great, I'm afraid. It's had sort of long kind of dictator-ish presidencies, a couple of major coups, and I think it's sort of, yeah, maybe once had a kind of reasonably democratic multi-party election. Been in sort of wars with Senegal, invaded Western Sahara. It's not straightforward, but interesting, and I think perhaps coming together now as a place. That's hard to tell from our perspective, isn't it? It's an Islamic republic as well. So why, one wonders, did they pick this book to translate? It's one of those books. It's published by Daedalus Press, but it was sponsored by Penn. So it's sort of they try and kind of support translations of authors in sort of around the world, perhaps from places where freedom of speech is not so strong. But the author, Beyrouk, is far from being the only Mauritanian and notable Mauritanian author. There's plenty of others, including various women. I managed to find the odd poem in translation by them, but nothing extended. Obviously a well-known writer in Mauritania nonetheless, because he's actually often just known by his surname, Beyrouk, and it's always a good sign of someone's level of fame, isn't it, if they're just known by their surname, like Pele, say, or anyway. He was born in 1957, so just before Mauritania became independent in 1960. He's studied law, then he became a journalist. He actually established the first independent newspaper in Mauritania, and so he's written 3 novels, I think. That's him. He came from a kind of a desert province of Mauritania, although I think now lives in the capital, which is on the coast. So why this book? Why translate this one? And there's always a tricky thing, isn't there, about being the first book from somewhere to get kind of translated and perhaps more widely distributed in the sort of Anglophone world, because it's almost like you're asked to be an ambassador for the literature and culture of your country, for your whole nation. I think this was a good choice because for me as a reader, it kind of took me on a bit of a tour of Mauritania in a way, in that it starts in the kind of Bedouin desert sort of tribal kind of area. You get to spend a bit of time in a coastal traditional fishing community. You spend some time in a kind of regional capital, it's like a small town really, and then in the capital city, which is the one, so really big city in Mauritania. And it is a book, I guess, that is about a society in a period of change, and that the kind of move between traditional ways of living and more modern ways of living. And I think, I'm sure that this was very much in Beyrouk's mind when writing it. I'm sure the whole take you on a tour of Mauritania certainly wasn't, because he's Mauritanian, but that sort of, let's think about how as a society we're adapting and changing to to sort of modern life, is undoubtedly in his head, because he chooses to write this. It's interestingly, as a sort of middle-aged man, he chooses to write it in the voice of a young woman, and from a Bedouin tribe. Now, the way the novel is structured is you have 2 timelines running, and it's a structure actually I like in a book. So you've got and they're about a year apart. So imagine you start with one timeline, and that's kind of like the present day at the moment that it starts, and then a second timeline that was like a year before, and you kind of follow those through, so you kind of get the how she comes to be in the position that she is in the first chapter. Does that make sense? I've not explained that very well. And they kind of run in parallel all the way through the book. A device I like. She's not, in some ways, quite a tricky character. Yeah, but maybe I'll come back to that. Yeah. Now, when I started reading this book, I assumed that it was set maybe in the 60s or 70s. And so I was quite taken aback, I guess, when we get to the bit in the capital city and there's people with mobile phones. So that was an interesting kind of wake-up call for me, I suppose, about assumptions that I was making about sort of, Mauritanian kind of culture and society. I think I might be forgiven for having thought that, because I guess their author is trying to convey that those tribes have almost a kind of like a timeless quality, and the book is called The Desert and the Drum, and the drum is central to the story. The main character, Rihanna, steals the drum, which is kind of like almost like the totem of her clan, and runs away with it. And at the end of the story, she burns it. So there's a kind of there's a strong symbolism about that, I suppose. One of the reasons why I think I could be forgiven for having not realised that it was kind of contemporary setting was that she grows up with a friend who's a slave, and I hadn't understood that till I did a bit of reading afterwards, that it only became illegal to own slaves in Mauritania in 2007, I think, and slavery basically persists now as a although it's technically illegal, and the government say they're driving it out, it's kind of very embedded in how the society works, I guess. Again, not knowing that, I kind of assumed that we were talking about something 40 years ago. What is interesting though is that a kind of a less, well, perhaps if it was like a white European interested in the history of Mauritania who had written this book, say, you might have got a less nuanced kind of understanding or feel for the story. I suppose what I'm trying to say is the kind of obvious plot of this book is you've got this young woman and she runs away from her tribe and she ends up in the capital city. Okay, and you could have a story that was basically, what should we say, sort of oppressed tribal woman escapes to be liberated in a more modern urban environment. This is not that story isn't that. Equally, you could have had a story that was like a young woman leaves her family and clan and traditional culture, goes to the city and discovers that actually her traditional culture was the best after all, and that she's lost something by leaving it. And it isn't that either. It's something a lot more subtle than that, and I guess that's what one of the things I really enjoyed about the book. The main character, Rihanna, she's quite a frustrating character. I think probably the nicest character in the book, the one that you warm to most, is Hama, who's a gay man who kind of takes her under his wing. And interesting to have a kind of a key character in the book who is a gay man when homosexuality is very explicitly illegal in Mauritania. Um, so yeah, it explores, I suppose, kind of politics and ideas and themes like slavery, the oppression of women, homosexuality, politics. You hear about a couple of elections and the way sort of the tribal leaders would basically ensure that everyone in their family clan networks all voted for who they said, so the idea of a free election was non-existent really. So all those things come up in interesting ways in the book, but they don't take it over. This is genuinely a story and a interesting piece of fiction. So I would recommend it. I think it's easy to get hold of. You can buy it in paperback. You can get it on a Kindle as an ebook. So give it a go and Scallydandle to Mauritania yourself.